a director who's had a ton of acclaim throughout his career, but his previous film, White Noise, was very poorly received and a downright rejection from both the masses and critics alike. And Noah Baumbach has returned with a film that I think is much more Noah Baumbach-y with Jay Kelly. Would you like to introduce the film and give some of your opening thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So we saw Jay Kelly at the cinema the other day. This is a Netflix movie, but we did see it on the big screen where movies deserve to be seen, specifically Noah Baumbach movies. I think it's such a shame. Obviously, it's a good thing that directors like him can get the budget to make the film at all, but it's still a shame to think about so many people, seeing the Noah Baumbach movie on fucking Netflix. It seems weird to me. I mean, same with Guillermo del Toro, same with Rian Johnson, who we're also about to talk about, but that's a whole different conversation. I think you're right that this movie very much so does come out in the context of the failure that was White Noise, this big swing for the fences that Noah Baumbach took, totally rejected, one of the biggest box office flops ever, or at least Netflix flops ever. It also came out right in the middle of basically the worst time ever to release a movie, which was COVID. This film got totally destroyed critically. No one watched it. And I think it really did create a bit of an existential crisis for Noah Baumbach, which he's talked about, talking about like, what the fuck is going on? Should I quit making movies? Am I not good at this anymore? It really, inspired some of that. But I also think that what people aren't talking about enough too, is that it's not just the context of that film, which Jay Kelly was crafted. It's also in the wake of Barbie, which Noah Baumbach co-wrote along with his wife, Greta Gerwig, obviously. And that saw him reaching, new career highs in a sense, albeit in a very different part of Hollywood than he had ever experienced before. Obviously, it comes out of the independent scene. His wife, Greta Gerwig, comes out of the mumblecore scene, right? But then they team up to make this movie Barbie, which becomes like one of the biggest hits, if not the biggest hit of that year. A huge, global sensation, a movie that's quite literally based on a toy. This is a whole new level of fame and probably got Noah Baumbach into rooms that he'd never been in before previously in his career. So I think a lot of this movie kind of comes out of those conflicting feelings of success, but also failure. And like, I did something that I wanted to do and I failed, but I did this other thing that appealed to more mainstream people and it worked. And just this weird kind of creative space that would put an artist in. In addition to that, I also obviously think that this movie is very meta when it comes to George Clooney and his place in his career. It's even said a couple of times in the film that Jay Kelly, the character that George Clooney is playing, often plays himself in the movies, just like, of course, George Clooney does. And that's what this movie is about. Jay Kelly, this actor who's a, famous leading man, a real George Clooney type, obviously. But he finds himself in a weird place in his career, in a bit of an existential crisis, maybe a bit of a midlife crisis, you could say. And that inspires the events of this film and the journey that he ultimately takes. I liked a lot about this film. I ultimately have mixed thoughts on other aspects of it. But there's a lot to unpack here. What was your original or initial reaction to Jay Kelly?
Yeah, I love how you set this up because I do think that you're so right that the Barbie element and his relationship to his own wife, who is just exploding in popularity, and all of the polls, and I'm proud of the people around me for succeeding, but obviously as an artist you're vulnerable and you're insecure and you're selfish and narcissistic and all of these things at once. And obviously to get ready for this movie, I wanted to make sure I didn't ever get caught with my pants down on Palm Dorks and be like, oh, I don't know what movie we're talking about, or I haven't seen that very famous movie. And I heard that this was going to have some Fellini vibes, and I watched 8.5, and I did catch a lot of what he was doing that was inspired by that. However, if I'm going to just come out and spill the beans, while there was a lot that I liked about this movie, I thought that the casting was very good. I liked George Clooney. I thought Adam Sandler was exceptional. And it's always exciting when you get to see Adam Sandler do something really cool where he's a great actor and you're like, wow, I can sense how talented you are. And I now start to appreciate the fact that you've never given in to the critical, a crowd or the critic bashing where they say everything you do is terrible, when you're like, no, I like to do this, but when I decide I want to do a Noah Baumbach movie, or when I decide I want to work with PTA, or when I decide to work with the Safdies, I bring it, and I am just as good as any other Hollywood actor from my generation. Always very good to see that. Very exciting to see that for Adam Sandler. And Laura Dern, it goes without saying, she's always exceptional. She brings life to any role you give her. I swear to God, you could be like, Laura, just show up and here's the lady you're going to play. Just go ahead and get in the role and vibe. She just has that natural ability to become the person, even though she's so famous. She's so iconic looking. You totally believe she's playing whatever role she is. So I loved all of that. My criticism of this film is that I do expect a lot from Noah Baumbach. I was really hoping that he would have a return to form. I watched White Noise, was tragically let down by it. I thought it was an embarrassment from the guy. I really felt bad for him, how humiliating that film was. It's not, guys. It's him being so insecure. He tries to be a bunch of other filmmakers. And while he did return to his roots in this, and I liked a lot of what he was doing, it felt safe and it felt well-tread ground, and dare I say, a hair pedestrian. So I just didn't find myself being moved by it in the way that I was hoping to. I thought that there was a compelling story being told, and the exploration of a man's life and the existential crises, but I couldn't help but feel like it had been done better by other people.
I couldn't escape a similar feeling myself, Zach. And I do think some of the kind of like, generic feeling of this movie is almost intentional. Like it does feel like Noah Baumbach wants to make a movie that doesn't just appeal to the kind of people that have seen The Squid and the Whale, for example. But like this could be just on Netflix and some like aging, 55-year-old dude puts it on and finds himself really invested and touched. I think that's what he was going for, kind of in a way that a similar movie, which I also feel this was inspired by, totally succeeds at, Tim Burton's Big Fish, another film which also has Billy Crudup in it and really nails a lot of the sincerity and emotional tenor that this film, I think, tries to, specifically towards the end. And I love Big Fish. It might be my single favorite Tim Burton movie. I could gush about that film for a little bit, but that is just one of the films that this reminded me of. And I think that specifically in the second half, this film really tries to swing for the fences in emotional ways that don't quite work out. I ultimately feel like this movie is actually at its best when it's funnier, when it's more light and comedic than it is when it tries to get deeper, darker, and more emotional, which again, it does try to do at several points to varying degrees of success. I think that, you mentioned 8.5, and there definitely is some of that Fellini vibe, specifically the first. I kind of thought it would go more in that direction, but then it ultimately started to feel like the movie Sullivan's Travels to me.
I haven't seen that.
It's a great film from the 40s, directed by Preston Sturges, about this director, this really rich Hollywood filmmaker who basically decides to go out on this trip to experience normal life. I think he even like dresses up as a hobo and like, pretends to be a hobo and like go out and like see all the, see the real Americans that he's supposedly making movies about. Great film, one of the funniest movies ever, and it is sincere. It's not a total farce, but I don't think it takes itself as seriously as Jay Kelly does, which again I think ultimately becomes this film's biggest weaknesses whenever it tries to take itself so seriously and really get you to care about this Jay Kelly character and like all of his torments and stuff like that. I don't know if it's able to really ever properly tap into that darkness of the character where it wants to go in a way that seems sufficient. Again, I think this film is at its best when it kind of feels like more like one of Noah Baumbach's earlier collaborations with Wes Anderson, something that's very much about these family dynamics and some of the interesting comedy that comes out of that. Not even at its best is it as good as a Royal Tenenbaums or a Darjeeling Limited, but it's definitely reminiscent of that earlier writing style from Noah Baumbach. But again, with that more like kind of generic vibe to it, which I'm not even saying is a bad thing on its face. I kind of appreciate the vibe where Noah Baumbach is trying to make a more accessible film here. I just don't really think he succeeded. But yeah, ultimately, I feel like this movie should have focused more on the comedic aspects. I don't think this film needed to try to be as dark and as serious as it sometimes gets, because I just think that those moments don't work as much. And also this film often can't decide which characters to actually focus on. You mentioned the Adam Sandler character, who I really liked. I would have preferred that Jay Kelly's main character dynamic be between him and the Adam Sandler character, which it often is, but then it also wants to be about his relationship with his dad and a relationship with not one, but two daughters and all these other family members who keep getting introduced through these flashbacks that really kind of drag the film down. So I think if they had kind of, edited it down to be more just about Jay Kelly and the Adam Sandler character, punch up the humor a little bit and not take itself so seriously, we could have been really looking at something special here. Unfortunately, those are the main criticisms that I had while watching this film.
Yeah, it does give Wes Anderson, and I'm glad you brought that up because there's a specific gag. There's actually a couple of specific gags that really scream Wes Anderson. Like, this isn't a spoiler, but there's a recurring joke that happens where he says, "Oh," where his daughters are like, "You're never alone," and then somebody shows up with a beverage for him immediately. That just felt like Wes Anderson timing. That felt like a recurring gag that I could have seen in Royal Tenenbaums, but also in something like Grand Budapest Hotel. And that's another criticism that I had of this film, was that I was looking for a director that would impose more of themselves and their vision on this. If I would have watched Wes Anderson's interpretation of Jay Kelly, we would have at least gotten richer sets and we would have had a nicer looking train, and it would have been funnier and snappier, and there wouldn't have been this effort. Even if he would have gone for an ensemble cast, he knows how to enter with a cast member, have them have a quip that impacts the story in some direction, and then get rid of them, right? Almost like a stage play. Wes Anderson's gotten very good at doing something like that. I think that he had too many influences, because when he did the Fellini thing, it would be like, oh, George Clooney's going to look through a mirror and then see a memory. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's very 8.5. But you're right. It goes for too many different tones. And I just feel like Noah Baumbach is still insecure. He still needs to just be confident in who he is. I keep thinking of the line from the movie Almost Famous when they're talking about Lou Reed, and the kid's like, I like Lou Reed when he's not trying to be David Bowie. He should just be himself, And I think Noah Baumbach should stop trying to be Wes Anderson. I think he should stop trying to be his idea of Noah Baumbach, and he should just try and be himself. Not that he was trying to be Wes Anderson, but you know what I mean? Trying to be this idea of all of the great filmmakers at once, instead of just allowing himself to be the guy that was Noah Baumbach, because he's made so many great films. I know I haven't seen Marriage Story, but I love Francis Ha, and I think Squid and the Whale is probably my favorite Noah Baumbach movie. I think that movie's a masterpiece. I think all of us can relate to being the kid in that movie in a weird, like, perverse way. Not that I ever plagiarized Pink Floyd, but the fact that you're like a snooty, like, arrogant little kid. I think that, it's honest and vulnerable, and it's clear that Noah Baumbach was that kid. And I just want him to get back to being honest and vulnerable and not trying to do an impression of himself.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think that's fair. I do think this is an ambitious movie, and I don't think he was just like playing it safe. It seems like he was kind of swinging for the fences, specifically emotionally here. I mean, this is definitely a movie that's like trying to make you feel these big emotions and reflect on your life and stuff like that. And again, in parts, it succeeds. I don't want to totally come off like I hated this film. I actually quite enjoyed it while it was happening. I think it's totally decent. I think if anything, much like some other films we've talked about recently, we're both kind of holding this to a pretty high standard because of who made it. Noah Baumbach, we know what he's capable of. We know how great his early work is. And ultimately, when you're talking about Francis Ha and the Squid and the Whale, and even While We're Young, which I think is one of the more underrated movies of his, I do think he works on a more intimate level and a smaller scale. This film's trying to be a big globe-trotting adventure, and again, folding in all of these different character dynamics. And ultimately, I just think it gets a little bit too cluttered, specifically with the family element. I think probably the single worst decision in this film was like to include his father and his maybe one of the daughters would have worked, the one that's actually on the train at one point with him, but the other daughter who's like older and that's only really talked to through flashbacks and on the phone, I thought that could have been cut, and the movie basically would have been just as good, if not way better. So again, it felt a little bit cluttered. And then the last thing I'll say on this film is that, again, it wants to like tap into this darker kind of territory for the Jay Kelly character, which I appreciate. I think, again, it's an interesting and bold choice to kind of paint him as someone who's like a narcissist, essentially, at least in the eyes of almost everyone around him, his manager, his daughter, his father to some extent, right? Like they kind of paint him as this, narcissist. But I also think that even though George Clooney is so perfectly cast in this film, and even though the whole film is like basically made for George Clooney, I do kind of feel like he was a little bit miscast here, because of the fact that I don't think that George Clooney ever truly properly is able to tap into and embody the darkness of this character at this point in his life. I mean, it's not a bad performance by any means, but again, even when this film wants you to take it the most seriously, even when it wants you to be the most emotional, and even when it's getting into this darkest stuff, I still just see George Clooney, being George Clooney. I don't see this tormented narcissist who's really in the middle of this existential crisis. And I'm glad they didn't go a more cliche route by having him like getting drunk the whole time and like descending into a more kind of stereotypical version of darkness. Like this is a very George Clooney version of a descent into darkness. But even with that, again, it still just kind of feels like George Clooney, who's a great actor, but I don't know if I ever believed him in this point of his life. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, yes. Even with the meta jokes, even with the limited range of George Clooney being baked into the cake of this movie, when it asks him to do more, it suffers, right? And that's why this movie can't get off the ground emotionally, because it's all anchored and tethered to George Clooney. And George Clooney is a billionaire who's super handsome and hasn't really probably suffered in the last 35 years. And he can't get there, right? He doesn't have it. And I think George Clooney is a really serviceable actor when you're making a movie like Ocean's 11, right? He's awesome in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, right? There are roles that are made for George Clooney. I think he has a well-deserved, illustrious. I liked him in The Ides of March, right? When he directed himself. I think he is capable, right? But I don't think he's rangy enough. I don't think that he's weathered enough. He's actually one of the remarkable guys that's gotten more handsome as he's gotten older, right? He's just conquered the silver fox lane. So, and all of those things just compound to like, this is what you see when you're there. And so I don't buy at all, yes, that he suffers or that he even really wanted to re-engage with his daughters, all of these kinds of things. I think the film could have embraced the fact that he was an asshole and made that part of the joke, and it would have worked far better.
That's exactly kind of what I'm getting at. I would have liked to see them cast an actor in this film that actually could plunge into that darkness, really be a protagonist who is kind of a cock, one that you kind of are rooting for, but you hate yourself for rooting for because you clearly see how much everyone in his personal life hates him. I think that would have been a much more interesting approach. And I feel like this film couldn't decide if they wanted Jay Kelly to be a likable George Clooney or a narcissistic asshole. Yep. And it never really works out, which is funny because, you mentioned Silver Foxes. I think that one role where George Clooney, voices the main character is Fantastic Mr. Fox. And they absolutely do pull off that exact thing, which is another film that Noah Baumbach co-wrote.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, I'm almost sure.
Damn, that's crazy. I had no idea.
Real quick, just to make sure, but I'm almost certain that he did. I know he wrote a couple of Wes Anderson movies in that time period. I'm pretty sure that was one of them. But either way, that is a movie that actually nails this dynamic that I'm talking about, where the main character is likable, yet you also see the ways in which his narcissism negatively impacts his family members and the people around him. That movie is a brilliant example of that working just perfectly. And I think it's the kind of role that George Clooney was born to play, but the writing is just more sophisticated and more intentional when it comes to the actual construction of that character. And also because of the fact that it's a Roald Dahl adaptation and animated film, I don't think it feels like it has to get so dark as this movie does, right? So it does feel a little bit more vague when it comes to his more narcissistic character traits, whereas this film really does want to plunge you into the deep, dark depths of his psyche. And again, I just don't think that the script can get there, and I don't think that George Clooney can get there as an actor when it comes to working with this material. But again, ultimately, I did enjoy this film. I think at its best, it is really fun. There's some great dialogue. All the acting is great. Like you said, Laura Dern is a real highlight here. I actually prefer her performance in this to her Oscar-winning turn in Marriage Story. So, there's a lot of reasons to see this movie. As you mentioned, Adam Sandler is great. And I wish that it had focused more on the Jay Kelly Adam Sandler relationship, the George Clooney Adam Sandler relationship, than all of the other family members. So it's a mixed bag because, again, there's a lot here that I like, but ultimately I don't think it's able to kind of thread all of these different needles together and create something that comes together fully.
Yeah, that's exactly how I felt. I felt like it was a standard film. I thought that it was going over well-trodden territory, and it did so serviceably, especially when you're considering the high-level talent that was used to make this movie, the budget that they got from Netflix, and the fact that Noah Baumbach wrote and directed the film. I gave it a solid 3 stars. Wasn't unhappy I went and saw it. I thought it was a perfectly good film, just a pedestrian one, and one that didn't move me personally.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I struggle between a 6 and a 7 out of 10, maybe a 6.5, strong 6 out of 10. I liked it. I enjoyed it. I did get a little bit emotional towards the end. In fact, I was joking on the way home that I was like, you know, at my age, I have no right to be reacting to this film the way that I did towards the end, because I was like, I'm not old enough to be moved by this film in the way that I was. But yeah, towards the end, I was pretty moved. I cried a little bit. It's an emotional film, but ultimately one that just doesn't quite deliver on what it sets out to deliver. But still, definitely, I think this represents a bit of a comeback for Noah Baumbach, coming back from white noise. At least this isn't a total embarrassment.